Transportation research has changed so much over the past few years. Come learn more with Dr. Tom Sanchez at our next podcast episode. Welcome back to another episode of the COMTO Colorado Leaders in Transportation podcast, otherwise known as the COMTO Colorado Lit podcast. I'm your host, Eulois Cleckley, the COMTO Colorado chapter president and the executive director of the Denver Department of Transportation and Infrastructure. And this platform is really the place for you to learn from and hear some of the greatest minds and leaders in the transportation industry. And so today, we are happy to have our guest join the COMTO Colorado Lit podcast for today. One of, I think, the more renowned researchers in the transportation equity space. We have today Dr. Tom Sanchez, who is he was a professor of urban affairs and planning at Virginia Tech University. So Dr. Sanchez, we're so happy that you're able to take some time out today, join the COMTO Colorado podcast, and look forward to the discussion. So welcome.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Eulois. I've been looking forward to our conversation.
Absolutely. So let's go ahead and just start it off. We always ask our guests a little bit of their background and really to help understand how folks have been able to navigate this transportation career and get to the position where they're in currently. And so give us a little bit of background about yourself and how you rose to the current position that you're in.
Yeah. Well, I grew up in Southern California, north of LA, and all during my childhood, I saw lots of development occurring, and especially in places where I didn't quite understand. I mean, they were all the fun places for us as kids where we were riding our bikes and, orange and lemon orchards and other fields we thought were fun, and then they were being built over. And we thought, I can recall that pretty distinctly. And then thinking about why is this happening? Certainly not understanding it at that age, but I think that kind of instilled in me an interest in the environment. And I didn't really distinguish between kind of urban environment and natural environment at that time, but went to school as an undergrad for environmental studies. Was greatly influenced by one of my professors who taught the urban planning classes. And so that kind of exposed me to a whole new dimension of how do I engage with these issues? And then soon after graduating as an undergraduate, went on for a master's in urban planning and got more interested in housing development issues. I worked for a nonprofit housing developer in the area. And that was a great experience for me. After graduating, instead of going directly into planning, I went to work for a for-profit private developer down in Orange County. And so having a background in learning about kind of the public service, kind of the public aspect of planning, and then moving in kind of to that private sector where I'll say there was a different set of priorities than what I was, what I had learned about in school, or it was different. And so that really, I think through that, I saw some things that brought up questions in my mind about, how is decision-making happening here, where we're deciding to build, what's fair, who's benefiting from, from these developments and other improvements in infrastructure that are being made, and just the whole process was real interesting from both the community standpoint as well as the planning standpoint and the practical standpoint of, how does this all come together to shape our communities. And then I had been interested in returning to school. I really enjoyed the research aspect of what I saw my professors doing, and so went back for my PhD at Georgia Tech, and it was there that I got I got particularly interested in transportation and kind of mobility and that part of how urban spaces are shaped and how they perform. And along with that, got more directly interested in the question of fairness and social justice and equity. The interesting thing at the time, though, kind of early 90s, middle 90s, when I was writing my dissertation on equity impacts, I'll say, there were very few sources that I could draw upon, from the academic literature or otherwise that were talking about equity. There were a few pieces out there, and I'm also willing to bet that if we were to go back to transportation plans and comprehensive plans at that time, early 90s, you won't see the word equity, in any of, those.
Right.
And so, which doesn't, seems like a long time ago, but it's not really. And so on one hand, I guess we should be happy that, that is part of the conversation now where it wasn't before. But in my mind, I think we still have a long way to go, which I imagine will be some things that you and I will talk about today.
So that's, I mean, it's amazing. You talked about starting off as a youth, really asking, well, how are things planned and how are things built and why? And I'm sure you're probably asking the same question so many years later after all, of your expertise that you gleaned over the years. So it's a consistent battle, right? That we're always challenged with getting a clear-cut answer to that question. Why do these things happen the way that they do, purposefully or not? And what's the unintended consequence?
I look at it as continual learning, because, we get new circumstances or we get old problems kind of, with a new label on them. All the other things that we're facing today that we just, have to ask ourselves, how did we get here? I thought we figured this out before. I thought we understood it better than we do today, but it's just the process of having to dig back into it.
Let me piggyback on the one thing you said, that, the same thing with the new label on it. And then you mentioned the fact that in the 90s, with all these plans and these planning requirements, for especially around transportation, if you want to have a project eligible for federal funding, that the term of equity wasn't even included in that. And right. This is kind of a new phenomenon. So what are some of your thoughts about, just the history of how cities or states or even a country has kind of approached kind of urban planning? And is it the same thing repackaged a little bit different, or is there really been a sea change to really try to understand equity and kind of what it means in the planning world?
Yeah, well, I think nearly all change seems to be, very, very slow when we're talking about decision making for urban places. We've got the political context is part of that, which is important but challenging, as far as the decision making process, and even the information that we need, to make these decisions, or how we include evidence as part of that decision making process. It's been gradual, but we've seen kind of that concern about equity and about social justice, and I'm thinking about it mainly from from an academic perspective and kind of the research perspective, but also from what we've seen public planning agencies do in terms of their plans. But a lot of that focus over the last, 20, 25 years, and this was, true for myself, is we're really asking a question of what is equity and how do we measure it?
Right.
What is it, what does it mean? Or I should say, actually, the question we're asking is what is inequity? And what is injustice? And how can we identify that? And I think that's been a majority of what the research has been about over the last couple of decades is here's what inequity looks like, and here's how we measure it. But that doesn't, and I would say that it's at least I'll speak for myself and a lot of the work that I've done. I've been naive in thinking that by identifying it, that will naturally lead to a solution. Hey, like they say, sunlight is the best disinfectant. You bring it out to the light, and of course we're going to fix it. Well, right. I don't think that's necessarily occurred. And, with the analogy of the disinfectant, sometimes it's not just sunlight. It's a good, strong detergent and a good, strong scrubbing, to get out, whatever the problem or issue is. So,
yeah, that's interesting. I think it's some of this stuff, lack of a better term, I label it like the boogeyman, right? It's around, you don't know what it looks like. You don't know if you're able to address it. When you see it, you don't know, even if you do see it, or if it's a parent, you don't know how to handle it or capture it and go fix it. And it seems like it's just a never ending cycle to try to address, these complex issues that really last for decades. And it's something that, at least here in Denver and the state of Colorado, I know we have been trying to really do a much better job understanding equity and how to plan better for neighborhoods and making sure that we don't end up creating those inequities that you mentioned as a part of our work. But it's, we're going to get into a couple of questions around kind of what your research has been able to glean around some of the issues that have been brought to bear, but eventually we have to get to solutions, and we'll get into that a little bit later. But I think for our viewers here, it would be good to just explain a little bit around the type of research that you've been involved in around transportation equity. I'm very familiar with your work. I remember we had a conversation years ago, and I was impressed with your 2004/2005 study that you did, I think with Harvard University around transportation equity. But it would be great to kind of just give a background of some of the research that you've been engaged in over the years.
Sure. Say I was, from the transportation perspective, I was particularly interested in public transportation. And so I've looked a bit at, roadway and highway development. But really my focus has been on, publicly provided, transit service. And so, like I said, a big part of that initially was, how do we detect where, inequity or unfairness is, is being manifested in the, in the investments that we're making. But then, as you know, even taking something like public transportation, there are so many different aspects of that, from operation to capital investment, to the planning and budgeting, in that whole process for designing those systems. So can you have a fair system that didn't include community involvement or public participation aspect to it in the plan making? Can you have a fair system that doesn't serve all parts of the city or the region fairly? And not to even kind of get into, what does equity mean with that in that respect? I've seen this in a lot of cases, even issues around safety at transit stops, convenience and cleanliness and, overall, types of service. What do we measure? And the other part of it too ends up being, what is transportation for? And so it's to get us places. And so over time, my research and what I was looking at kind of revealed to me, okay, well, there are connections to jobs, there are connections that we need to make to school, connections we need to make to healthcare, family, other opportunities, kind of, regionally and locally. So then there ended up being kind of lots of parts to it. And so, but is that I put this out there as a question that I'm still considering today. Is that the job of transportation to link jobs, and is the outcome that people find jobs and stay employed? That's an outcome of that. But for transit providers or transportation service providers, is that part of their domain or not?
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah. Well, I mean, what do you think? I think in the, especially the transportation service providers for the general public, I think that is something that agencies consider as an outcome. How well are you connecting not only neighborhoods, but connecting people to jobs, places of employment? And because transportation is the second highest expense for a household, access to sound, reliable, safe transportation sometimes dictates, people's income levels, and people make decisions around where they live with respect to the type of transportation and access to the type of transportation that they want to utilize. So, I think, yeah, it would be great that if, as a metric, there is an outcome to say that transportation is about access to opportunity and to jobs. But I mean, what through your research, do you find that institutions still kind of grappling with that a little bit, or has it changed to really understand what it's all about?
Well, one of the other factors that you alluded to there is the land use dimension too. So here we are trying to, connect parts of the region or, parts of whatever jurisdiction that we're working with, while at the same time, we've got this arrangement of land uses that we're also trying to, we're trying to factor into that equation. And for me, the challenge there, when this seems to, the question goes beyond transportation, is I'm really struck when we look at these maps of redlining areas, and now the legacy of those redline areas where we see segregated cities that almost look today exactly like those maps of the 50s or 60s or even into the 70s. And so how do we solve or how do we address issues of inequity when they're so deeply rooted in history and in the decision making that that went into building those places? And so I think we've tried to do this a bit with busing and desegregation. This has been part of kind of the spatial mismatch hypothesis of how do we better connect residential locations with employment locations, but at the same time, we're having to factor in, skill levels and education levels and match those with job opportunities and, and where, particular kinds of jobs are being made available. And we've certainly seen shifts in those nationally as far as, what kind of jobs are available. So there's so many moving parts to it. And, and there's a lot of sophisticated planning again, as so much sophisticated intelligence that goes into trying to plan transportation systems really as the vascular system for urban places. without that circulation, to all, and I think of it kind of in terms of the body, without that circulation to the organs or the muscles or, the whole body, that's where we see disease, that's where we see, health problems.
Right. Exactly. Choke points, and you just your vessels, your blood vessels are clogged with high cholesterol.
Right.
It becomes congestion and choke points. Yeah, it's that's amazing. I've used that I've thought about the transportation system in that realm as well. You talk about land use and the like, and really, if a city or a region is a body, the heart is really in this downtown, and then everything kind of proliferates out there, and it's just a whole circulation system of just people and freight that you have to try to manage. And
right. And
sometimes
sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, and I think the other part that we're grappling with is the issue around mobility, or is it around accessibility? And so is it a case where people just need the facility to be able to move? Are there adequate, are the networks adequate, if they're able to move? Or is it building those linkages between locations, like, between residential locations and jobs, or residential locations and shopping, or, for food, for that, for that matter. So,
yeah, that's a great point, because, and this, I think, goes back to, I think, a fundamental question you asked, basically, what is, when we start talking about transportation, really, what are we talking about? Are we talking about the access to those jobs, or just having people that have different options to be able to get around, whether it be for recreational purposes or anything other than a kind of home-based, work-based trip, right? And what should be the priority for a city or a transportation agency to really focus on? And I think we would say, it's all of the above, but you can't, and it's difficult to prioritize it. But it's a very good point that the system needs to move everybody as efficiently and safely as possible, regardless of the type of trip and the type of mode that you choose. I'm curious, you mentioned the land use and the impact that land use has on a lot of communities. And I'm curious, over your many years of research, based off of the fact that land use has changed so much in some of our more densely populated cities, that has had a direct impact on low-income and minority communities. So really, we're talking about gentrification, right? And its unintended consequences. But what has your research shown, or what are your thoughts around how land use not only impacts neighborhoods, but how does it impact people's transportation choices moving forward and all this, the changing times?
Yeah. Well, that gentrification question, along with particularly displacement, is a big, and I see that, where I live in DC, I see these, I think they're luxury condos going up in neighborhoods that, historically were single family, or, were row houses. And, I'm wondering, I know for a fact that the people that lived in those neighborhoods aren't moving into those new units or those new condos. Right. Where are they going?
Right.
And I saw this when I was in Portland, as well as, the movement of particularly, the neighborhoods and households of color to the east side of the city. Right. Which was more remote, less connected, and the appreciation on some of the homes, where it's incredible, and I guess that goes to the question of affordability. Right. I mean, where does it? I shouldn't say where does it stop, but how do we control something like that when there's such a level of demand to live in these places that it prices out certain neighborhoods. And I'm also thinking about kind of younger people that are coming out of school today with lots of debt, and they're already in the hole. What's the likelihood that they dig out of that and get a down payment together to actually be a homeowner, which I know benefited my parents and benefited me, and I'm wondering now, kind of generationally, what that's gonna look like. How's that gonna happen? And we see that for if we try to relate that to job opportunities, it's a big question mark. And so, I easily, I get away from the question of transportation here, because when you dig into different, get down to different layers of this, I think about the question of, what's a city, what's an urban place that we're trying to, fit this transportation system in. And it's about, it's about schools, it's about job, it's about healthcare. We're finding out, it's about crime, it's about law enforcement, it's about, what we're battling with on incarceration rates. It's like access to food. It's kind of like it's it's everything, and we can't. How do we distill that down to the issues that we can actually, handle or do something about? And I think this is the real challenge to, something like, if we're going to call it transportation equity, well, is that where we're going to stop? Do we say, okay, well, we want to have transportation equity, we want to have food equity, we want to have educational equity, we want to have healthcare equity? How do we, when do those all come together?
Yeah. These are huge questions, right? And it's amazing. You start off with transportation and it expands out to basically every form of human activity that we have to deal with. And so this is why we have jobs, Tom, right? This is why, you have to research and it'll be a never ending challenge to try to address. And really, I think circumstances change, right? Over generations. And I think you had a car culture that existed in this country when the interstate was being built, and there's mass production of vehicles and alike, and people sought after kind of living outside of the city, being able to drive maybe 15, 20 minutes to their place of employment, having some property and land, raising their family and the like, and doing it all in a vehicle. And then you've seen again over the years a transition to having more people move back into a city because it got so congested because everybody was driving. And so I'm curious of what you think now. Is there going to be another change around how people decide where they live and how they choose to get around? And I'm specifically talking about what we're dealing with right now, which is COVID. That COVID has kind of changed the game a lot, where we have many more people that are working from home and still being as efficient as they would have been if they were still working in the office. So I'm curious on your thoughts around how are the outcomes based off of what we're dealing with now going to still persist, and if it's going to fundamentally change how we need to think about transportation and all the other issues that you mentioned around land use and access to other activities.
Yeah, well, that's a terrific question, and I think it will be interesting to see what we learn and how much remains, or how our behaviors remain affected by our experience with COVID. Kind of when we reach that point that we're actually getting things opened back up, at least to the level that that we were at before. Perhaps we're seeing that we've got opportunities that we didn't realize that we had before, where there are work at home opportunities that we didn't consider. Will that kind of ripple through the system and actually be something that will be adopted, and that businesses will look at as greater opportunities to employ people? Kind of from the business cost standpoint, are certain businesses not going to have to, make that investment in, buildings and office spaces, which then they can actually use to hire, more people, or even pay, or even pay more. I don't know. We can only speculate, about that. The optimistic side of me hopes that we can sees these challenges right now and learn something from me. The other side of me says, I hope this doesn't head us down to even more issues around what's happened with labor and fewer rights, lower compensation, lower, rates of benefit. One thing I can see here now is, do people become more contract workers than full-time employees because of that transition of being in an office and the traditional sense of being, what an employee is, whereas now if they're at home, are they looked at the same way by their employer, and how does that translate into how they're compensated? So I think there's some very big questions for what work means going forward, and again, then that comes back to what's that relationship to mobility, or that need to move around. We've seen what's happening with our transit systems now, with lower levels of demand. I don't have to tell you, but those challenges of keeping some of those systems, alive and going are, that's real.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a challenge not only for cities to stay solvent, but in an environment where folks have had to really change their behavior around just being around people, and that's counterintuitive to what transit is about, right? And so, right. I think it is a large question: is after you kind of get through this current shock to the system, how do we need to be thinking about the ways in which people are going to desire to get around, and whether or not their personal safety is going to drive their transportation choices versus, some other thought or philosophy around how they want to be able to get around. So it's a great point, and it's amazing. We start off with transportation, and you force us to think outside of that, right? Because there's so many other things that get impacted, and we shouldn't be just focusing on just the nuance or the narrowness of transportation. It's really about how is society going to behave, through this time moving forward. So it's interesting. But
and I think about just real quick. I think about too, what kinds of investments we've made or haven't made in education, related to technology and the potential for knowledge work, which has the the greatest potential to work remotely or to work from anywhere. And I would say, there are other countries that are beating us at that, and have been able to incorporate the technologies because they made those investments in education and industry and infrastructure, ahead of us. And we're experiencing that lag in, what could be, jobs that are based on more of kind of a digital, digital kind of intelligence knowledge base. So,
yeah, that's a really good point. Let me ask you what your thoughts are around I would say the past 5 years or so around technology and the mobility space. And this is, again, putting kind of the current circumstance with COVID aside, but the connected vehicles, the autonomous vehicles, the even going to the micro mobility options with the scooters that that I just love here in Denver, and and bike share and all this other stuff. Like how do you see that changing, or and how should cities integrate these new technologies into how we move people around?
Yeah, yeah. And I have a real interest in technology and how that can affect and shape cities. It's probably about 10, 9 years ago. I was teaching a course with a colleague from Ohio State on a this platform called Coursera about the cities and technology, and we had 10,000 people from around the world sign up for the course. And so it was one of these online courses, but just kind of showed you what the interest was in, the future of cities and how technology was going to play a role in that. And now I teach a class called The Future of Cities. A little, technology is a part of that, but we're also talking about the social dimension, the environmental dimension, the economic dimension. How do those pieces come together? But I'm hoping that the technology part of it, and I think we've seen this in a few cases, is really kind of looked at as an easy sort of solution. We need more sensors. We need more data. The decision making and the plan making, can benefit from that. We're just going to know so much more. And the issue that, where I kind of stop in thinking about that is, I wonder, we're not fixing crumbling bridges. Our water and sewer distribution, systems and kind of those systems underneath the roads, and even, kind of all of the parts that go into our streets and our highways and all are not in great, repair right now. So do we need to leapfrog that and think about these new technologies from an information kind of management technology perspective before we, kind of fix it first, or fix that, those critical elements of cities? Is it time for a major, public works project to, across the country, to fix, to fix what we have in place right now? I think there's as much, I'm no economist, but there's got to be as much kind of economic development potential in doing some of that, compared to, trying some of these new technologies. So,
Yeah.
But it's probably, the answer is probably a balance,
Right.
between the two. We don't want to fix the old with just, the old ways that we used to do it, and the old materials and the old methods. Hopefully we can inject, some of the new technology into that's more durable, more efficient, more effective.
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting, you mentioned around things that really the nation should be deciding what to invest in. And is it your traditional kind of capital maintenance programs around your existing hard assets like roads and bridges, or something else? And I think we're going to be going into an interesting time with the new administration, hopefully coming in, focused on re-energizing the nation's economy and figuring out a way to do that through some type of investment coming from the federal coffers there, or federal programs and federal dollars. So, I think it's an exciting time, and I know many of us that work in city DOTs or work at states or even transit agencies. We want to have a say in kind of the next generation of infrastructure and transportation for this country, and we're right on the precipice of that. So it's going to be interesting to see what shakes out, especially at the federal level. Let me
Yeah,
ask
and
you.
here we've made that connection again between transportation and economic vitality.
Right,
You know,
exactly.
that and jobs and kind of well-being for families and and households. But in that respect, the transportation really is as a job generator, as a generator of economic activity. And I think related to equity on that, the piece that we don't talk about enough is for minority-owned businesses, that can be involved with that process, with that contracting, with the hiring and the employment of people, to do that. We need to make sure that we do that fairly and make those opportunities,
Absolutely.
available. So again, along that spectrum of what transportation's about, the building of these, the design and building of these systems, and the enormous amount of energy and labor that takes. There needs to be some fairness in how we do that and how we make those investments.
Absolutely. And I'm glad you bring up that point. I think this is something that is at the forefront now, which is trying to make sure everybody's included in the local, state, or nation's economy. And you should not be excluded based on your race or gender or ethnicity and the like. And we have programs set up to try to make sure that there's fairness in contracting, for a lot of our public sector programs and the like. But it's always a challenge, and always having folks prepared to do the work, having the process in place that holds, primes responsible and accountable, as well as the government that's managing these projects, and make sure that we're held, responsible and accountable for making sure everybody has equal opportunity to participate in the nation's economy. The time is now to make sure we kind of live up to that. And with everything that's gone on this year, from the pandemic to the George Floyd pieces, there's been so much more conversation around equity and the like. We've been talking about equity in the transportation infrastructure realm, but there's this whole other side of that you mentioned around just the business side of the game that we need to make sure that there's equal opportunity out there for everyone. So I appreciate you bringing that up. Let me ask you, Tom. What?
I want to mention too on that point, and this came up with a couple of conversations that I've heard Freddie Fuller talk about. Is comes back to that access to capital. That's really, that's a critical part. It's one thing to invite people to the table, but if they don't have the same level of of power or influence or decision making that goes along with with capital, have we accomplished anything, or can we expect that anything's going to change? So I think that's a really, that's a key aspect of this when we think about business ownership and participation in hopefully what will be kind of a an economic transformation, or or infusion or resuscitation of our country.
Yeah, and it's very good points, and things that we need to make sure is at the forefront of how we're thinking about moving forward. So Tom, let me ask you. I go back to one of, I think, your research projects where you identified kind of a mismatch or disparity in representation within the industry. And representation meaning at certain leadership levels or certain organizations like council of governments or metropolitan planning organizations. People are supposed to be there to represent the people that they so-called serve. But you look around the landscape, it's pretty it's I would say it's very nuanced in one type of person. Usually it's older white guy who's there making these decisions on behalf of a diverse population. So talk to us a little bit about kind of what you found previously, and then what can we do now in this current circumstance to really figure out how we can have fair representation across the board.
Yeah, and this goes back to my point about the research on equity and what it's been focused on is identifying where the inequity is. And so it was kind of, it was no surprise when I did the survey of all the MPOs across the U.S. to find out, that their board composition didn't match their social, the demographic composition of their jurisdictions. Mm-hmm. But that evidence hadn't been made available before, so I was able to put that together and kind of confirm the obvious. But then the question becomes, okay, now what? Now what do you do? And so is it a question, where pressure is put on some of these organizations to be more representative in their appointment of commission or committee members? What does that look like? What is that? What is that process? You're breaking some old habits, on trying to do that, and kind of those networks that have been built over time. Is that going to be enough? And that goes back to my point of, okay, you invite somebody to the table who hasn't been there before. Is that enough if they don't have, the same resources or the same leverage, in their decision making or in the whole kind of, political context to make something happen? Is it is it just kind of a courtesy sort of, invitation without a genuine, without the
Right.
genuine, motivation, behind it. And,
Right.
and that's the thing, that's the thing that we, when these cases around equity and especially discrimination, when they actually do make it to lawsuits, the court's going to look at those and say, was there intention in discriminating, or was there intention in excluding certain people or certain businesses? It's not that obvious. People, it's just that the way that functions. I mean, within these organizations, it's it's not that clear, and there's a bit of cleverness in how this, how these decisions are really made and who gets included and who doesn't get, included. So, but how do we, how do we get at that? I realize I'm asking more questions than, than I'm providing answers, but, this is,
but it goes
kind of peeling back the layers of the onion here on what the issues are.
And it goes back to what I say is that some of this stuff is just the boogeyman, and some of it is done purposefully. You made mention of the fact, well, how difficult is it to really find out whether or not an organization is purposefully being discriminatory? It's almost impossible. However, I do think for leaders of an organization, it's kind of your responsibility to kind of find out if there's issues and address it head on, and then also set up processes in place to kind of protect the organization from turning into something that you probably don't intend it to be, which is one that might not be fair to all the staff. So it's something that I know in my tenure here, in my current role, we've really been trying to learn what the problem is. We understand some anecdotal things, but how do we collect the data to turn into information to help us create a process that everybody feels is fair and equitable? And that's again, it's a new thing that we're working on, but a lot of organizations are trying to figure this out during this time as well. So hey, Tom, we've been talking about some heavy topics here, and before we get out of here, I'm going to learn a little bit more about you personally. What do you like to do? I mean, what's outside of spending many hours just writing research papers? What else do you like to do with your time?
Wow, that's a terrific question. I've been, I'm fairly active as far as trying to stay healthy. So, getting exercise and being outdoors, that's changed it a little bit with what we're facing right now. My partner is very involved with the arts, and so I'm kind of with her quite a bit on that and learning about that world. To be honest with you, I think I've got a real kind of curiosity that is my hobby, and this might sound kind of strange, and you may or may not want to include this as part of this interview.
We'll keep it.
But some recent research that I've been looking into is how certain insect communities build neighborhoods.
Huh. Interesting.
build nests. You have ants and bees and wasps. How did they do that? There's a certain level of social organization involved. There's a certain goal involved, and some of the literature I've been reading about is actually about ant transportation. How do ants decide how to move stuff around within the ant colony to the benefit of the whole community? And there's a hierarchy of workers involved. So there's a level of organization that we might say that's not as complex as human beings. But how do we, how do we know? They've sustained themselves for, millions of years and are, might have the potential to go on longer than us. And so it's been kind of a different avenue that I've been looking at and related to some things around, knowledge and intelligence as part of our decision-making and plan making. But hey, is there something that we can learn from these other communities, that are all around us that might have something to teach us?
Yeah, that's amazing. You don't even think about that, right? So, ant transportation but more importantly, the building aspect of it.
Right.
There's probably some relatable things that we probably could learn from our insect family, right? So
I know it sounds weird, but I mean, you think about some of these communities and they're pretty complex, and they involve some kind of decision making, and there are goals and objectives, in place. So
that's amazing. We may have to do a whole separate podcast on ant transportation. Interesting. But awesome. So hey, Tom, we're getting ready to come to the end here, and Dr. Sanchez, really appreciate you taking the time out. I really value your research and everything you've accomplished over the years and the publications that you've been a part of. I often reference them a lot, and when we start talking around the topics we discussed today. Is there a place where somebody can go and kind of see all your works and the like? Is there a link, or how would somebody be able to get in contact with you or learn more about your work?
Yeah. I've got a website that is also a blog. It's tomwsanchez.com.
Okay.
And so got some things that I blog about there, as well as a list of publications and things that I've been working on. So that's probably a good place.
Okay.
Twitter a bit too, at Tom W. Sanchez. And so that's mostly all about kind of research and professional things. So those are probably
perfect. So Tom W. Sanchez.
Right.
.com is a good source. So everybody listening, make sure you check that out. And again, I've had the pleasure of reading a lot of the publications that Dr. Sanchez has been a part of, and those of you who are very interested in not only understanding and helping to define the problem, but using some data from different cities across the country to really hone in on what these issues are and potential recommendations, I would suggest check out some of his work. That's for sure. Hey, Dr. Sanchez, before we go, anything else you want to make mention of, and before we close out?
No, I think that this has been a great conversation. I really appreciate you, inviting me to, to talk with you about it. And these are going to be issues, we're going to be wrestling with, for a while. My hope is, we'll bring some new thinking, some new types of collaboration and participation together to, maybe do some things differently. Absolutely. And move forward in a positive, in a positive way. That's my hope. That's my hope.
Awesome. Well, we definitely appreciate your time today, and blessing us with some of your thoughts and insights, and it's been very valuable and unique, and definitely appreciate your time.
Yeah. Thank you, Eulois. I appreciate it.
No problem. So to close this out, everybody that's viewing today, just remind you that we here at COMTO Colorado, we are here to support your life's blueprint. This is the place where we can help you build, organize, learn, and earn your way to a great transportation career. With that being said, we're signing off. Good day.
Well, thank you, Eulois. It was great talking. I really do appreciate it.